Thomas, class of 13.5, and agents of demonstration. Take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm very excited to share with you some of the results of my thesis I've been working on. I'm a political science major here at Middlebury. I've been working on this thesis with Professor Ewan, Professor Teets, Dickerson, and Johnson. So let's take a look. So North Korea's been in the news a lot recently. This notoriously isolated country has been conducting military drills, they've been parading their missiles, and they've even been targeting mainland United States cities. The North Korea question is part of a larger question about what do you do to get authoritarian countries to transition to democracy? And if we zoom out and look at this question in a larger context, we're going to see the following. No. Okay. Oh, now you want to. Okay. If we graph the number of democracies over time, a very interesting pattern emerges. See, a democracy is not a straight shot. In fact, it comes in waves. So we can see increases in democracy in blue and then increases in authoritarianism in red. To really illustrate what I mean by these waves, though, let's take a look at the most recent wave, the third wave. Let's go to Europe. We have authoritarian communist countries shaded here in red, and just 4 years later, all of a sudden these countries become democratic. No. Apparently they're still communist. That's unfortunate. So, how did this happen? Well, it's part of a process that political scientists call the democratic demonstration effect. What this is that if one country successfully transitions from an authoritarianism to a democratic regime, then it's easier for subsequent countries to do the same thing. So a great phrase that went around at the time that wasn't too far from the truth was the following. In Poland, democratization took 10 years. In Hungary, 10 months. East Germany, 10 weeks. In Romania, 10 hours. And this is not too far from the truth. Okay, so that's democratic waves. How do you cause these things? How do they happen? And this question has bamboozled political scientists for quite some time. And it's because of our tool set. We've been using case studies to analyze these different waves. But we constantly run into the problem that in our research we find correlated regional disturbances or domestic factors that could explain these waves. We can't actually understand the waves themselves. What we really need to do is what a biologist or a chemist would do. Would be some sort of controlled experiment where we could just look at the effect of the waves in isolation. But how could you do this? It would be akin to doing a controlled experiment on the scale of the world. It'd be like creating the matrix. So it's impossible, right? Well, surprisingly so. It's very possible. We've done it, and I'd like to share the results with you. So, how did we do this? Well, we used an up-and-coming technique called agent modeling. What this is a computer simulation where you have a simulated world, and within that world you have simulated agents, which follow very simple rules and interact with each other. Have any of you ever watched a flock of birds? Some species of birds have leaders, and birds just follow the leader as they flock around. Other species don't have leaders. So how did they manage to flock? Someone thought of making an agent model like this to demonstrate this flocking behavior. We created these birds, and they follow very simple rules. If they see a bird that's somewhat nearby them, and that bird is sort of heading in the same direction, the first bird will turn and will follow that other bird. And so what happens if you speed this up over time, let the simulation run, what happens? Flocking. No one's controlling this. There's no leader bird. This happens completely on its own, simply as the result of the very simple rules we set up. So that's this agent model. I'd like to show you ours. Ours has two components, the world and the agents. Let's first look at the world. The world, as you see, is made up of colorful countries, half of them democratic, half of them authoritarian. And each of these countries has citizens, or the agents. And these agents have an opinion about democracy. If they're not very big fans of democracy, we color them blue. If they're mediocre, we'll color them gray. And if they're so excited about democracy that they'll even protest for it, we'll color them red. And so we digitize this colloquialness into a scale from 0 to 100. And then each agent has its own copy of this inside of them. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion of democracy. And so the basic interaction of this model is two citizens meeting and having a chat about democracy. So one will say, I think democracy is fabulous. The other will say, I think democracy is lame. And as a result of the conversation, we take their opinions about democracy, average them, and that becomes their new opinion of democracy. This happens not just once, but thousands of times over the course of the whole model. And granted, yes, this is an abstraction of how the real world works. It's not exactly how it works, but it's an abstraction based on viable scientific literature that tells us how humans work in group conditions in regards to their preferences. So we have the agents, we have the world, let's put them together and see how they could interact. So in our model, how can we get a transition to democracy in an authoritarian country? Well, perhaps someone who's very pro-democratic, who's protesting for it, will convince others that democracy is a great idea. And once enough people in that country decide that they want democracy, then the country will become democracy. Now let's ante it up a little bit. Countries don't exist in isolation, they exist with other countries. And authoritarian countries are notorious for isolating their citizens behind their borders. Some countries, like North Korea, have very strong borders. There's no way you're getting through unauthorized. Other countries have more porous borders that allow a freer exchange of ideas. And so if you have this more porous border, you could get a free flow of information. And so this is another way to ferment democracy in another country. And you could do what's called a cross-border chat, where someone who's very pro-democratic will go into the other country and spread pro-democratic ideas around it. So that's some examples of how the world could work. Let me show you what the world actually looks like when we have the simulation running. This is really cool. So we have the democratic countries in blue, the authoritarian countries in red, and all the little white are the opinions of peoples about democracy. So what's the experiment? What are we trying to do? We have two hypotheses for the causes of these democratic waves that we observe. The first one is geography, and the second one is media broadcasting. And we'll talk about each of them in turn. First, geography. To examine this, we're going to use a very neat thing called Moran's eye. Now, what is this? This is really cool. What you could do is give a computer a picture that looks like this. If you have democratic countries, say, in white, authoritarian in black, you put this checkerboard pattern, Moran's eye says, oh, it's -1. If you have a more random configuration, Moran's eye equals about 0. And if they're sharply divided, as we would expect, Moran's eye should be closer to 1. Okay, so that's geography. Now let's look at media broadcasting. So here, we have a democratic country, and the media will broadcast pro-democratic ideas to the citizens, increasing their opinions about democracy. And this also works on an international scale. So you could have a democratic country broadcasting pro-democratic ideas to more authoritarian countries. And this actually happens. In the 2000s, when the United States was trying to overthrow Serbia's leader, Slobodan Milosevic, they literally built a series of transmitting towers around Serbia to broadcast in pro-democratic ideas and objective news coverage. Okay, so those are our two hypotheses. Let's look at some results. We have this first configuration with no broadcasting on, just looking at a pure geographic effect. This is what the simulation looks like at the start. We run it through to the end. Not a whole lot of change. Not very exciting. And in the 40 times we ran the simulation with this configuration, there was only an average of less than 1 democracy. Not a ringing endorsement for geography. Okay, let's look instead at media broadcasting. Let's turn both those on, and let's see what happens. Whoa. 17 new democracies on average every time we ran the simulation. If we were to graph these, chart them rather, what you see is that the more broadcasting we enable, the more democracies we get, and interestingly, the effective geography seems to decrease as well. So, what does this mean in terms of real-world consequences? Well, let's go back to our friend on the Korean Peninsula. Many people think that North Korea is an irrational actor, and they're just crazy. But what the results from this model say is that the North Koreans know what they're doing. And they are very strongly attempting to isolate their citizens. They put them behind this huge militarized border. And even if you do get to go to North Korea, they won't let you talk to them. The North Koreans understand that if you allow this free flow of ideas about democracy, then you might end up in one very soon. And they don't want that to happen. I'm actively working on this project as part of my thesis for my next 2 semesters here at Middlebury, and I welcome any questions, criticism, and feedback. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Ian. Questions for Ian?
Yes, ma'am.
So just because you have a couple more semesters to go, where do you see the direction of this research going? It looks like you've already done quite a lot of analysis on your model.
Yeah, so now what we want to do is we want to add in some more things that we think could relate to democracy. So we want to add in wealth. We want to add in education. We want to add in these things called turning points, which are focal points where there could be a huge tipping point in people's opinion about democracy. So we want to add these things in there too, and then we could do a more variable analysis to see which of these things had the biggest effect. Because some literature says that there are certain GDPs in which countries are likely to transition to democracy. And so if we build that into this model too, it becomes more accurate and more telling. And it also accounts for more cases like the North Korean case, where some countries just will not democratize no matter what we try to do. There's another one?
How do you define democracy and authoritarianism, and what do you do with countries that might be displaying democracy but are actually exhibiting more authoritarian issues, like maybe the U.S.?
Yeah. Sure. Very good question. From my standpoint, I'm trying to look at this simply as the spread of ideas, and so not being pro or anti-democratic or authoritarian. So definitions of democracy vary over time, and if you were to look back at that chart that showed democracy starting in like the 1820s, that definition of democracy was if you were a man and you could vote. That was their definition of democracy. So it changes over time, and presumably it will continue to change. For purposes of this, we just use the label itself. We don't take a position on what's a democratic factor versus more authoritarian factor. We just accept what the literature labels these countries. Question over here? I thought so. Yeah.
So it seems like at the end you said no matter what we try and do, we can't change North Korea. I was wondering if you took into account authoritarian broadcasting to try and change democratic countries, and how that would change the model.
Yes, and that is one of the things we're building into the 2.0 version of this model coming this fall. Because authoritarian countries do broadcast, and they do share their ideas, and do try to encourage other countries to adopt more authoritarian means so they can collaborate with them. Countries like it when they work with other regimes that are of similar type to them. So they absolutely have a big interest in broadcasting authoritarianism. This was not in this version of the model, but in the next version, oh yeah, it's going to be in there. Any other questions? Will you guys, oh, sorry, yes.
Sorry. I noticed that you ran the simulation with international and domestic broadcasting together. Did you try it with each one individually, and did that create a different result?
If you'll allow me, I'll go back and I'll show you on our chart what we did. So we did run it with different variations. And what we saw when we had just domestic broadcasting on, we got about half as strong of a number of countries becoming democratic as we did with both international on. Anything else? You guys have been a great audience. Thank you so much.